with the A+ exams, you have 2 exams. Obviously, the hardware and the software is kind of how they have it divided up. So these 2 classes do go together, but there's a couple of you that they're only in the 115 class, and there's a couple of you that are only in the 110 class. By and large, both classes are nearly identical in the makeup, but not 100%, which so we'll deal with that. So if you're only in one class or the other, you'll probably pick up on some stuff during the lectures, but obviously as far as the assignments go, just focus on Canvas, on the assignments for your class. Did everybody see that there's some assignments for the 110 class on Canvas? Okay. Very shortly, there'll be a few more for the 115. So again, you'll have assignments for both. For these 2 classes, I'll try to keep the assignments maybe a little bit shorter. So you'll have fewer questions maybe on each quiz. Again, with the assumption that many of you are in both classes, and then some of you are also in the networking class too. So I do take pity on you guys in terms of the amount of reading that's involved. In years past, these 2 classes were combined. They had books that had both sets of A+ stuff in them, but the books started to get quite large, and then many schools, and I sort of followed suit, the same the other schools were doing, was to divide these 2 classes up. I may go back to having them be one class. There's some newer books online that are, they're pretty good sized books, but they cover materials from both hardware and the software in a combined format. So maybe towards the end of class, you guys can give me feedback, because I'm always trying to make these things better. And then sometimes if the 2 books are not working, we can take a look and maybe look at some that are a combined resource. Okay. Well, that's 32 people in here today. So I think that's it pretty much. All right, so welcome. And we are going to be talking about a few things from the 115 book, but it's just good general information. And again, this is a review for some of you. The book starts off with the operating systems and talking about file systems, file formats, the path of a file from the root of the drive moving out. And I do find that to be useful. I have had instances in class where students, maybe they're downloading stuff, or they're really used to using the GUI and not really used to using the command line, and they haven't really seen, what a file path looks like. So back to my command prompt there. So I'll show you a little bit on the command prompt, and also in the book, this is just kind of going back to chapter 1 a little bit too, with file structure and some of the little tips and tricks that you can do in Windows. And I know for some of you, this is review, but the way I usually try to approach it is to, take it and see, if there's something that's new that I'll learn differently, even though it may be a review. There's other ways to do stuff. And then also with your computers, be trying to figure out the same thing, but on Windows 10. And it's pretty much the same, except for they've restyled the ribbon bar a little bit. So we'll take a look at some of these little tips and tricks that they've got, and try to make sense out of them. Okay, so one of the things they're talking about is directory structure and file extensions. And most of the time you guys are familiar with this, although in Windows, which is kind of an annoyance, I'll turn this to speaker view here. In Windows, they have the file extensions turned off. So a file extension will tell you, we're used to this. If you've got a paper you've written, it has a file name, and it might be a .doc, or more recently a .docx. So you've got 3-character file extensions were very, very common in Windows going back many years. Now they also support 4-character file extensions, which Linux has always done. But a lot of times this part is invisible. So if you're looking at this in File Explorer, you'll just see the name of the file and you won't see the file extension. So one of the first things I do is to turn on file extensions. That's a simple thing you can do. Here, I'll share the screen. This is talked about in the first chapter and stuff. Here we go. Share this. Okay, and it's mentioned this early in the chapter. It's talked about file extensions, and this is, maybe not new for you. So under the View menu, I've got my File Explorer open. This is, just plain old File Explorer. On the left-hand side, you've got options for, say, this PC and quick links. You've got each of your drives. It's got a quick link to showing you what each drive information has. You've got your search box up here, which can be very handy, especially if you're searching for particular files. So like the last file I was searching for was an ISO file, and I didn't know where it was located. So you can do a wildcard. So the asterisks. So if I typed in, star.iso, it's going to search for all of the files that have a file extension with a .iso. I didn't need to do that just yet. So it's got quick links to our desktop, and then here I've got my folder for this for these classes. So here's one of the class folders, and you can see that the file names do have extensions, but they don't normally have those when you first start up Windows. So again, one of the quick things that I do under the View menu, so you've got these little tabs across the top. Maybe you haven't explored this stuff to any great extent. If you're just using Windows 10, maybe you do stuff a little bit different way. You can see here you've got, this PC, desktop, CTS 120 resources. That isn't actually the file extension, or excuse me, the pathway. We can look and see what the exact pathway is to a file if you go to the properties. So if I select this file, also these little check boxes on the side, you can turn those on and off if you find those annoying. You go to the file and go to properties. It shows you the file location specifically. So here it's on my C drive under users/Dave/desktop. And then there's another folder called CTS 120 resources. And then it's got the actual file, the file name up here is CTS 120 quiz. That was the first quiz for that class. And it's got the docx file extension. It also shows you how big the file is and all that good stuff. You can also make the file read-only, which means that people can't make changes to the original file until they make a copy of it. So there's lots of stuff in here that you guys might check out. But quickly here, if I go back to the View menu, one of the things that I first do on any system is to check the box for hidden items. I want to see hidden files and folders in there. Microsoft has these unchecked by default. And the reason for that, I'm not really sure. I think maybe just to clean stuff up. You can tell a little bit about a file by these little tiny icons, but it doesn't really give you much information. So I apologize if this is new information, but so many times in my class, I'll be trying to help students and I'll say, okay, well, get the ISO file or get this type of file, and they won't know, about this, or it's not turned on, so it's not as easy to recognize. So by checking the box for file name extensions, you can see it adds if it's a .pdf or a .zip. Just kind of an annoyance for me that Microsoft turns those file extensions off by default, which I find to be kind of strange. So, all right. The file that I was actually going to use was the ISO file here, which I copied into this folder. So you can see it's in Windows 10. It's an ISO file, which means that it's an image file. In this case, it's an image file of an installation disk. So if you had a DVD, this could be an image that you'd create off of that. Okay, so this is all talked about in chapter 1. I know a lot of you are probably already past chapter 1 in terms of your reading, but if you go back through this stuff and maybe practice a little bit with it, if you feel super confident about what a path structure is and things like that, then this is stuff that you could kind of read on, and you wouldn't necessarily have to do the activities, but it's a good refresher if you're not familiar with those. And this does come up if you are doing data recovery, especially. So like if I open up my command prompt, notice my command prompt opens up and it's automatically in my users/Dave pathway, right? So if I want to see what's in this directory, so I can do a dir and I can see the other directories that are in my Dave directory. And if we were looking for that same pathway, so this is going back to command prompt stuff, and this does come up every once in a while. It's handy to know some of the basic command prompts to navigate. So you've got Windows, you can just click on stuff and you can open the folders, but you can also navigate through the directory structure. So if I go to my desktop, and also you'll notice if I start typing DES and then hit tab, it'll complete out the word for me. So I'll go to the desktop, I'll say dir to say what's on my desktop, and you can see I've got a bunch of junk on there. So I can start typing CTS, change directory, CTS 120. Whoops. And sometimes when there's spaces, it's actually a little bit goofy when there's spaces in the file names. So you can, again, you can use the tab key. You can start typing CTS and you can hit the tab key until it comes up with the one that you want. So in this case, you can see I'm in CTS resources, but there's spaces in the name, which does make it a little bit goofy when you're working from the command prompt specifically. And I can type dir again, and then I can see the files that are there. So you can see the pathway there and how I got there, and that would be equivalent to going to this folder through the GUI. So you've got the same stuff in it. There's the files there, and then here's the same files using the File Explorer. When you're working with server and you're working with some other, like maybe you're making a boot disk to do data recovery, knowing how to use a little bit of the commands, which we can come back to, is pretty handy. Or if you're using Linux, which we'll get to as well, there's a whole other class on Linux, and we will make little flash drives as part of this class to do some troubleshooting and things like that. So kind of understanding file structure is pretty important. So long story short, if you haven't read this part of the book, you know, be familiar with directory structure. So the root directory is the drive letter. So if it's a C drive, I have several hard drives on this computer. So if I look at my computer and I go to this PC, you know, I can see that it's got a C drive. There's another hard drive called data that I've labeled data. Now you can change what these are called. And it shows you the size of the drive and how much space is left on it. Then it's showing you the optical drive here, which has a movie in it, and then another drive partition that's completely empty there. But so anyway, the root of the directory structure is always whichever drive it's on. Now Linux has a whole different way of doing things. For Windows, you've got your root of this directory structure is drive letter, and then your pathway going out from that. So if you click on the drive here, here's my C drive. I was under users /Dave/desktop. And this can also be handy to know how to browse through the directory structure. Let's say somebody brings you a computer. I had a student asking, they had a computer that was dead essentially, and they wanted to get some data off of it. So if I unplug the hard drive and I'm accessing it from another computer, I don't always have direct access to that drive's operating system. I would be browsing through it with the file system. So in that case, I need to know where to look for stuff. And how many of you store stuff on your desktop? I'm bad that way. I've got folders all over the place and all sorts of junk on my desktop. So if I was trying to back up a computer, I would definitely want to look for the users, find out how many users that computer had. And then I would want to browse in and know that pathway to their desktop, right? So if you're in a user's container, go to each user, browse to their desktop, go to their documents, right? Those common locations that files are stored are what's going to be really important to that user. So documents, stuff that might be stored on their desktop, that's the stuff that you'd want to be looking for to back up onto the other computer. And in particular, if maybe they're looking for pictures, you would want to do a search, and you can search. If you click on this PC on the left-hand side, if you're searching on this PC, it's going to search all the drives. It's going to search the C drive, the D drive, the F drive. If I click into the search menu and I want to look for particular files. The wildcard I mentioned is pretty handy as well. And again, I apologize if this is new stuff. This is kind of covering the basics to get people up to speed. But if I'm looking for all of the .docx files, I can do a wildcard in my search menu. So if I'm looking for all the document files, I'd look for the star symbol. If you can see that, I guess I should write over here. It's a little easier to see. I might need to adjust that camera again. So the star symbol .doc, I could look for star.docx. I could look for, maybe that person has a bunch of pictures. If you figure out what type of files you're looking for, I could look for star.jpg. Now, it's possible that the program that was saving them saved it with a 4-character extension, so I'd also want to maybe do a search for star.jpeg, JPEG. We won't get into the GIF versus GIF debate. Who votes GIF? Who votes GIF? I haven't seen it in the store, but supposedly Jif Peanut Butter was going to bring out a peanut butter jar labeled with GIF on it. If they do, I'm buying one and just saving it as a collector's item. I have not seen it though.
Hey Dave,
Yes.
so I got a question. Maybe this is too soon to ask, but I deal with a lot of share files, and it's a pain on the butt when I have somebody else that left a file open, and we don't know how to close it. So I have to contact IT, and sometimes they have to escalate it because a lot of the people they don't know how to do that. So right now I'm at the moment when people is texting me, can you close this file for me so we can edit it?
Okay.
Like so maybe it's too soon, but I'm just
Yeah.
dealing with it right now.
Yeah, it kind of depends. And just to kind of answer his question a little bit, because I'm not familiar with the situation, it sounds like they have files that if they're open, multiple people have access to them. Typically, what you would want to do with permissions, and we'll talk more about permissions in these classes, but if you have a folder somewhere and it's shared, usually you would set it to be read only. And what that means is a shared resource somewhere on the network. If somebody wants to open a file, they need to essentially open it, and if they want to edit the file, then they want to copy it to their computer. And so I'm not quite sure the direct scenario that he's got, but it sounds like they have files that if they're open, other people can't make changes to them. But what they should be doing is if they're making changes there, they might want to copy the file to their own computer. Once you have a copy on your hard drive, you have ownership of a file. So we'll talk about file permissions and file ownership as well. But if you own the file, then you can make any changes you want and edit it. Now and then you're not making changes to the original document. So if he gets more information, you can always email me questions like that too, and I'd be happy to try to help out if I can. But if you have your own IT department there that they can call, they would probably be the ones to ask to figure out how to change the permissions or set those so that users have different access levels. Okay, so again, with chapter 1, chapter 2 is mostly about installation. So today I was going to show you briefly how to use Hyper-V, and then we'll also look at VirtualBox. Now, if you guys that are in the 9 o'clock class, if you remember at the end of your 9 o'clock class, not the end, at the end of the chapter, one of the big projects at the end of the chapter was to install an operating system into a virtualization. In your book, it gets to virtualization in the 115 book, but I think it's in chapter 8 or so. But it's such a useful thing to know how to do that we'll take a look at it a little earlier, mainly because we all have Windows installed already, right? We're sitting here using it. Some people might be using a Mac. But in class, one of the first things we might do is you all be sitting at the desks out here in the first week of class, we'd be wiping off the hard drives and you'd be reinstalling Windows because each quarter, you just kind of clean off everything that's on there before from the other users and you start up fresh with your new stuff. So learning how to install Windows is part of chapter 2. We're going to not skip over it entirely, but read through it. It talks about planning for installation. If it's a brand new computer, obviously you want to make sure it has the specs to run Windows, which almost all of them would these days. It has fairly low threshold for just running Windows. Now, if you want to run certain games and things like that, obviously your threshold is going to be much higher for that. And that's a big part of these two books too. These two books as well is looking at computers and trying to figure out, okay, is this going to work for what this person wants to do with it? Do they need to upgrade some certain things? Do they need more RAM? You guys that are gamers have been talking about new video cards and things like that. And that can add a lot of life to an older computer is to maybe upgrade the video card, maybe give it a little more RAM, running SSDs instead of a traditional hard drive. So like the traditional hard drives are mechanical in nature. I've got some of them with the lids off and you can see the platters in here actually rotate. They rotate pretty fast, 5,400, 7,200 RPMs or even more. That's pretty darn fast for rotational speed, but it's still a moving mechanical device where in terms of upgrading a solid state drive is more like RAM. It doesn't have any moving parts. It's just writing electrical signals directly to memory. Okay, so in the other part of chapter 1 that's important is copying, moving, renaming, deleting files. That's just basic file maintenance type stuff, but they have some good kind of explanations and things for that. And you guys are probably familiar with the keyboard shortcuts, Control C, Control V. They go through that a little bit. If you haven't used those can really come in handy for making quick work of copying and pasting versus cutting and pasting. So the idea of moving a file versus copying the file should also be, I hope, clear for everybody. If you cut and paste, you're moving it from one location to another. If you copy and paste it, the original is still there and you now have a copy, which goes back to the file permissions thing. If you have copied it from somebody else's shared location and you have pasted it onto your own hard drive, that copy you own and you're the owner of it. So in terms of permissions and file ownership, you can do whatever you want with it. The original stays in its original state, whatever location it is. All right, so at any rate, if you're reading through this stuff, I would say to try to maybe practice a little bit of this if you're not familiar with it. There's some easy kind of quick shortcuts. They mentioned the control key allows you to select multiple files, but they don't have to be right next to each other. So you hold down control, click, 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 but the files don't have to be right next to each other. Shifting and using either the arrow keys or your mouse will select a whole bunch of files, but they have to be adjacent. They all have to be next to each other. So just basic file maintenance. This is kind of at the end of chapter 1. It's surprising sometimes when I'm in class and I have students downloading stuff to install. And then I'm like, okay, where did it go? Well, typically it goes into your downloads folder these days, right? But you might be able to tell it to go to a different location and save the file. And then looking for the file later, that's when you get into doing a search for it or searching for specific files, that sort of thing. Your control panel, Windows has two separate types of locations for the traditional control panel. So if you just search for control panel, you're going to get what looks like this. So I do a quick search for control panel. And this is what they're talking about. It's in category view. I typically like the icon view so I can see all the different tools in here for each one. Category view, it will group things together. This is kind of just like on your phone where it's grouping objects together. I am not as big a fan of that as just simply just going into either the larger icons or the small icons, and then it takes one layer out of it. So you should be able to find stuff that way. If you're working on somebody else's computer, here's one of the tricks they talk about. If I'm working on somebody's computer, I might like it this way, but maybe they prefer how it looks normally. So if you're working with somebody's computer, you might ask them, hey, did you know that you can change this? But most of the time, what I prefer to do is, just leave it how you found it. If you're working in an office environment or for the help desk or IT, don't mess things up to make them look how you prefer them. Maybe they like them a certain way. And when you leave, their computer should pretty much look how it, unless there's something completely wrong with it, like, they're doing something really goofy, leave the computer in the way that you found found the computer to begin with. All right, these hands-on projects, I'm going to assume that if you are doing them, that's great. If you look at the hands-on project and you decide, hey, I already know how to do that, I don't need to be bothered, that's fine. Just move on. Sometimes you might actually learn something by walking through them as you go through, and they've got some options with the control panel here. Folder options. This is actually pretty handy when you go into folder options. This is what I was just showing you with the hiding of the file extensions. This is on page 20. Under the options here, you might notice if you're running Windows Home that you don't have BitLocker as a drive encryption. That's not included with Windows Home, but it is included with Windows Pro. So there's one of those differences. We'll be looking up the differences for the different versions of Windows 10 as well. So we've got several versions of Windows 10. We'll kind of figure out what the differences are. They change periodically. Has anybody heard too that Microsoft is basically, we're going to have, supposedly, we'll see what happens, but Windows 10 is what we've got, and they're just going to keep updating it. So instead of having like a Windows 8, we don't know what happened to Windows 9, but Windows 8, Windows 10, we're just going to have updates to Windows 10 at this point is kind of their idea, but we'll
Windows 9 was a sham.
we'll see what happens with Windows 10. I mean, are they going to re-release, have a new version come out that'll just be called, Windows Forever Edition or something like that. So, so we'll see. That's kind of how Microsoft works these days. But okay, power management is also discussed. Again, going through this pretty quickly. You can turn off hibernation mode, and that will save some of your hard drive space. What that is used for is for 7, 8, 9. What that's used for is to bring the computer back when it's out of hibernation. It kind of brings you back to where you were using Windows before. So it saves your system state, but it does use up a pretty big chunk of your hard drive, and it also makes it longer to shut the computer down and restart it. Although when it starts back up, it appears to be how you left it when you quote unquote turned it off, but you pretty much just put it to sleep at that point. But under power management, that's some stuff that you can change with power management settings. That's a little bit more applicable to laptops in terms of saving the battery life and things like that. Our electricity is fairly cheap, so if you want to leave your computer running all the time or leave your monitor on, it's not going to hurt the device at all. It will use a slightly bit more of electricity, although modern screens, monitors use a lot less electricity than the old ones did. These things started with the power management stuff with that Energy Star program. If you think about a big building with hundreds of computers in it, and they were using those old style monitors, those big square ones. When those were all running, they used quite a bit of electricity comparatively. And if you have hundreds of or even thousands of computers that you can put to sleep and shut the monitor off, that makes a difference. Okay. All right. So again, just kind of going through this quickly. I realize some of you are not in the not in the 115 class. This is the book for the 115 class that I'm looking at right now. If you're only in the hardware class and you're watching the lectures, there's some good information. That's why I was putting it up on the board as well. In particular, being able to search for file types, that sort of thing, just knowing file structure and the pathway for files. So like, can you browse to somebody's desktop? Do you know how to get to the desktop from either the GUI? The command prompt will get more into that, but there's some basic commands, change directory, stuff like that. Okay, we are typically running 64-bit operating systems, but you can go into the system settings and you can view more about your operating system. This one is 64-bit. Pretty much it shows how much RAM it's got here. This is right-clicking on the start button and then going up to system. Notice if I left-click, it brings up my tiles and my files that I've been used. There's also a settings option here. So Windows 10 has kind of changed that. This is stuff that can be customized, but don't forget about right-clicking on stuff, basic stuff, but right-click on menus, check out the options that you've got. You've got a left-click menu and a right-click menu for various items. Okay, so 64-bit stuff, pretty typical unless you're running an older laptop or a lightweight laptop. Some of those are 32-bit. For the most part, all of our computers these days are 64-bit capable computers. They will run 32-bit applications and they can run a 32-bit OS if you really wanted to, but you're not getting the full operation. So the idea with having 16-bit, 32-bit, how many of you are old school gamers and remember some of the older platforms?
An 8-bit god.
Yeah, so like the old Nintendos, you had 8-bit, 16-bit NES, N64. So what they're talking about is kind of similar. They're talking about the pathways within the processors of those devices. So here we're kind of switching into hardware stuff a little bit. But a 64-bit processor can handle 64 ones and zeros. If you want to think about them marching side by side, you'll have, or a 64-bit highway would be 64 lanes wide versus a narrower pathway of 32 or 16 bits. You'd have, and a bit is a 1 or a 0. Remember from our networking stuff, 1 or a 0 is a bit. Fundamentally, computers are handling tremendous amounts of data, but at the very most basic level, it's just a bunch of ones and zeros, which again, I find truly fascinating that, you and I, all of us are talking on Zoom. This is data that's going across the internet as ones and zeros. And there's so many of them that they can create a pattern, which is, you know, voice and video, and, you know, you got the book on the screen. So pretty crazy, but 64-bit is basically better than 32-bit. You've got a wider highway pathway to allow that data to take place. So, but yeah, you guys that are gamers, if you remember some of the older consoles that were being developed, there's actually on Netflix, there's a documentary I've been watching called High Score. If you guys have Netflix, that is kind of interesting. It kind of covers the original games and their development and how they kind of grew into more and more complex games, obviously. Okay, so moving on here, we've got, trying to see if there's got some activities that they have you using some. Okay, so we've got work groups and home groups on with Windows. Windows 10 is capable of doing peer-to-peer stuff. Windows 10 Home cannot be joined to a domain, but for us, since we're working at home anyway right now, in the classroom, that would make a difference, even like, say, next quarter, where we might be setting up servers, things like that. Windows 10 Pro would be able to join a domain. Now, we can set up Windows 10 Pro in Hyper-V. So that was the other thing I was going to show you, was the idea of creating a virtual machine.
Wait, does that mean you can make a virtual machine inside a virtual machine?
Yeah, well, actually, it's funny you asked that question. They do have that option now. Our computers won't do it, but they do have the option to virtualize inside of a virtual machine. So you're going, it's like going deeper into the matrix kind of thing. There isn't really a whole lot of much of a point to do it, but yeah, you can do that now on certain machines. Okay, so I'm going to share this screen real quick here. Looks like the chat window is mostly about games and stuff. So again, I'm going to ignore the chat window, but if a legit question comes up, either yell at me that it's in the chat room or just yell out the question, unmute yourself and start talking. Okay, so on your start button or on your search window, if you type in features, just the word features, F-E-A-T-U-R, you can see that it pops up. This is part of your control panel. This is but turning Windows features on and off. So I've got that popped up on my screen here. So I will go to this screen. So here's my list of Windows features. Now this is one of the things that I was mentioning too with Windows 10 Home Edition. If you guys are following along with me, if you did the little search, you know, click on your search box and then typed in features, you should get this option to open up turning Windows features on and off. Now these are things that are built into Windows that you can enable or disable. And that's actually kind of cool. You know, you can even run, you know, they've got Internet Information Services here. So that is a web server. So Windows 10 can run its own little web server. It can run an FTP server. Windows 10 is very similar in its kernel and the way that it's built to Windows Server and Windows 10 share a lot of the same similarities that way. But with Windows 10, they have kind of like restricted certain things so that you could only have maybe 10 people connecting to your computer at a time. Otherwise, businesses would use Windows 10 as a server platform. So the one I was going to show you was Hyper-V though. And how many of you, your Hyper-V is it grayed out if you're trying to do this right now? And if you're not trying to follow along, that's fine. If you're just watching what's going on the screen, it can be difficult to multitask if you don't have more than one monitor too. So if you're just kind of watching what's going on the screen, totally fine.
I don't even have that option on mine.
Are you at the screen where it says turn Windows features on or off?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Hyper-V may not be listed or it might be grayed out.
Yeah, it's not even listed on mine.
Okay, so if you right click on your start button and you go to your system, are you running Windows 10 Home?
Yes, it's Home Edition.
Okay, so Home Edition doesn't include Hyper-V. So I'm going to show you Hyper-V, and I'm going to show you VirtualBox, which is a good program that's very similar but does not require Hyper-V, obviously, because you're running Windows 10 Home. The other reason it might be grayed out for some of you is if you're running a laptop, your CPU might not support Hyper-V. And so in that case, it'll be grayed out if you're running a laptop for those reasons, or may not appear in the list if you're running Windows 10 Home. So I've enabled Hyper-V already, and because I'm running Windows 10 Pro. So I'll show you what the Hyper-V Manager looks like. And then we'll look at VirtualBox if we have time. Okay, so you can see this is the Hyper-V Manager. This looks just like on server. So if you're trying to run Hyper-V on a server, it's the same exact thing. So I've got a couple that I've already installed last year. I'm gonna make a new one. So each of these, if I look at the properties in here, I can see that this has, you know, basically it's giving you a list of the pretend hardware that the Hyper-V operating system is going to be using. So basically you're sharing some RAM, you're allocating some space on your real hard drive for a virtual hard drive, which is essentially just a folder that your computer is going to treat like the hard drive of a computer. So it's kind of a cool system. You can see it's also got, you know, network adapters you can add. All right, so I'm going to go through and real quickly give you the rundown. Now, also, if you're in the 9 o'clock class, this is one of the activities for that class. The reason I'm showing you this is something you might want to play with chapter 2, where it's talking about installing an operating system. There are some benefits to running stuff in virtualization. If you want to play around with an operating system, you can do whatever you want to it. And if you mess something up, then there's no great harm to your host operating system, as long as you realize when you're in the Hyper-V environment versus when you're in the host environment. And that can get a little confusing sometimes if you're running them full screen. So sometimes I recommend, you know, making a distinct background inside of your Hyper-V environment so you know that you're in the virtual Windows 10 versus the real one. All right, so over here on the right-hand side, I'm gonna click New Virtual Machine, and I'll just walk through this fairly quickly. And then VirtualBox is almost the same thing, but it's from a separate company. It's not part of Windows built in, so you download it separately and it'll do the same thing that Hyper-V will. It'll allow you to run a virtual machine inside of your computer. So before you start, you'd want to make sure you have, this is part of chapter 2, you know, preparing for the installation. How much hard drive space do you have? You know, if you're installing this in a virtual machine, do you have 2 hard drives in your computer? Do you just have 1? How much empty space do you have to make this happen? If you don't have enough empty space, you know, you don't want to try starting this process if you're down to your last, you know, few gigabytes of storage space, right? Okay, so this walks you through. Microsoft has gotten pretty good with these little wizards that they have in terms of, you know, walking people through the process. So if you're anything you're doing, if it's in class here or at home, you know, as you're walking through it, take the time to read what it's telling you. That'll sometimes answer questions or fill in some of the blanks or just kind of make you a little more educated computer user. So it's basically just telling you the wizard is helping you create a virtual machine. You can use these in place of physical computers for a variety of uses. Lots of businesses are now using virtual servers. And I mentioned some of the benefits the other day. You know, if you have one physical computer and it can host multiple virtual servers, you can divide up their responsibilities. And then if one of those virtual servers crashes, the other virtual servers keep running. Now, granted, that one physical computer, if it has a mechanical problem, you know, physically has a problem, that can cause a single point of failure. So there's some pluses and minuses, but it's definitely worth, for us as IT people, it's worth looking at virtualization because it's very common and seems to be kind of getting more so. All right, so I'm gonna click next. I'm gonna call this is gonna be my Windows 10 trial that I'm gonna install. And it says I can put this in a different location. Now, I usually want to take and check this in a different location if I had more than one hard drive, and I do, because you can see that my C drive is pretty small and it's getting to be full, but my data drive, I've got 500 gigabytes free. So in this case, you know, storing it in a different location is a good idea. And I can create a new folder in here if I want. So I'll click on new folder and I would call those, you know, virtual drives, something like that. Not a bad idea to keep your virtual drives all in one location just for kind of, you know, storage location. Okay, so I'll say select folder. Notice it put the pathway in there. It's on the D drive, subfolder called virtual drives. That's where it's going to store my VDI, my virtual disk image for Windows 10. Generation Gen 2, I usually use Gen 1. Generation 2 does give you a few more options, but you have to know which one you want to start with, and you can't change it later, it says. So usually I stick with Gen 1. It's for most of the stuff I'm doing. Now here's one of the goofy ones. Its startup memory is only 1 GB of RAM. Well, that's not going to make a very snappy performing virtual machine. And it also says use dynamic memory by default. So dynamic memory means that, let's say you allocate 4 GB of RAM, your virtual machine won't use 4 GB unless it needs to. It'll use up to that amount. So you guys that were doing our system specs the other day, how many of you have 8 GB of RAM? Is anybody running 4 GB of RAM, like on a laptop or something? Okay. If you only have 4 GB of RAM, this might be an exercise that you can walk through and look at how it's done. You could try allocating 1 GB of RAM and see what happens. And your virtual machine will boot up, but it'll be very slow. I'm gonna go ahead and give this one 4 GB of RAM. Now notice that it's in megabytes. So 4,000 megabytes is roughly 4 GB of RAM. Now technically it's 1,024. So if you want to, do the math, you can multiply 1,024 by 4 or by 6 or by 8 or whatever, and it'll give you that exact amount of RAM. I'm going to make it 4 GB of RAM and make it dynamic. Under the connection, you will have a default switch. If you've installed Hyper-V, you can use the default switch. I'm using the one that I created because, again, our classroom is set up a little bit differently where we have to define specific addresses. But otherwise, you can just use your default switch, and your virtual machine that's inside of Hyper-V will be given an address through the default switch and by DHC. So your home router will be giving your virtual machine an address too, if that makes sense. So it's the default switch kind of acts like a pass-through into your virtual machine. All right, now here's another weird one. It says create a virtual disk. That's great. Size. I'm not sure why Hyper-V makes, if you guys can see that, the default size is 127 gigabytes. That's ridiculous. It does not need to be that big. I'm not sure why that is the default size. So I'm gonna make it 20 gigabytes and see if that's enough. That's probably enough to install Windows and maybe have a couple little programs in there and not use up too much space. Maybe I'll make it 25 just for fun. And that's pretty big. I think the default installation of Windows 10 might take up 10, 15 gigabytes, something like that. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead. So make sure I'm just kind of pointing out the little the points that you might run into if you guys are gonna try this at home. So how many people think they're gonna try to play around with Hyper-V or VirtualBox? I should see every hand shooting up. Now again, if you're running 4 gigs of RAM or you've got your hard drive almost full, obviously this is gonna be physically not possible for your computer to do this. But if you can manage that, then this would be a good option. All right, so now I'm going to say I'm going to install an operating system right now. You can come back and do it later, but if you have the ISO file already, so this is where the other day we were looking at Microsoft's website of downloading a trial version, and you can Google that, trial version of Windows 10. Microsoft is happy enough to let you download a trial version of Windows 10 Enterprise. It's an ISO file. So you have to remember where you put it. Is it under downloads? Maybe. In my case, I put it in this folder. So I've got my Windows 10 ISO. So what this does is basically it's treating it like a DVD that's in a drive, even though it's not. So it's mounting the ISO image. It's going to give it a drive letter, and it's going to boot off of this virtual installation image, and that's pretty cool. So you don't need to have a disk laying around. We used to do that all the time in class. We'd have all these installation disks that we'd burn and make copies of. Nowadays, I bet some of your computers don't even have an optical drive. Anybody?
Mine does.
Yeah, a lot of them do, but a lot of them, especially laptops, because they're trying to make them as thin as possible, don't come with built-in optical drives. You have to plug in an external or whatever. So, all right. So I'll click next and then finish. It's creating a virtual machine. So it's giving it, virtual memory, virtual CPU, virtual network card, all that good stuff. It's currently turned off. So I'm going to double click it to start up the virtual machine. And at this point under media, if I click on media and look under DVD drive, you can see that it's got the ISO connected to its pretend DVD drive, right? So it's going to boot off of this ISO. Later on, you'll want to go in and say you want to eject that because you don't want to have it continuing to try to boot from that ISO. If you're not careful, it'll accidentally go into the installation loop again, and you'll end up reinstalling in your virtual machine. So at this point, I'm just going to click Start. And it is starting up the virtual machine. And this is essentially the initial boot up, just like you would have on a real computer. This looks just like in chapter 2, where they're talking about installing an operating system. Right now it's booting up off of the installation media. And this is a fresh, clean installation, just like you'd have on a real hard drive that had been formatted and is, you know, completely wiped. And I won't bore you with the complete installation, but I'll go click Install Now. You can tell that it's in the virtual environment because in a second it's going to tell me I'm installing to a 25 gigabyte disk. You could say I don't have a product key. This is a trial. Here I've got choices about which version. Now this isn't the same trial that you guys might download. This is one I already had on this computer. This is a version of Windows that I already had. So I can select a bunch of different ones. I'll do the Windows 10 Home just for fun. It doesn't matter. I'm going to probably wipe this off anyway. All right, accept the license terms, click Next. So whenever I'm doing an installation, I typically choose custom. Upgrade might work if you were upgrading over the top of a previous installation, but under custom, it allows you to delete or format partitions at this stage. Right now, I've just got one single 25 gigabyte chunk, one partition that I'm going to install to. So I can just click Next. If I wanted to, on a real computer, you could click New and create additional partitions here, or you can delete existing partitions, which you want to make sure you know what you're doing when you do that. Okay. And at this stage, it's just going to keep copying files and doing its thing. And I can, at this point, you know, let it, you know, minimize it and let it do its thing here. So I'm going to show you real quick here. Okay, so VirtualBox is another program. If you're downloading it, get it from virtualbox.org. Go to Downloads, get your Windows download file, which I downloaded the other day. It's currently in my CTS 110 folder for the other class. If you're doing these, you have to pick one, right? So if you're running Hyper-V, there's no need for VirtualBox. If Hyper-V is grayed out or unavailable under Windows features, you guys would want to be downloading VirtualBox and running through the installation of that. If you're in the 9 o'clock class, if you happen to be in the 9 o'clock class, the instructions for doing this are part of an activity at the end of one of the first chapters. Otherwise, we'll look at VirtualBox later, and if you want to check it out, it's fairly straightforward. It's the same idea. You're creating you click on New Virtual Disk, walk through the installation process, point it towards the ISO. So I'd recommend downloading the ISO first so that you have it available. And that was located, you can just Google search for Windows 10 trial. Just type in Windows 10 trial download. Top hit is Microsoft's Evaluation Center. It says try Windows 10 on Microsoft Evaluation Center, and get that ahead of time. So you're all set with that. And let's see what's on the chat window. You guys are having, there's 57 messages on the chat window. You've got quite a bunch of stuff. So people are asking some questions about, Ibrahim says he has 100 gigs left. You're going to try VirtualBox. Yeah, so that would be a good project over the next few days. You know, working on your take home. Keep an eye on this one too. I'll probably have some, I'll have some test questions for the 115 class as well. So there's a few of you that are only in the 115. So log into Canvas, look under announcements, look under quizzes for both of those assignments that you might have for both classes. And I'll try to keep them relatively small because I know a lot of you have 120, 115, and 110. And that can be a lot of homework, I guess. And I know you guys have other stuff going on too in your lives, and I don't want this to be, I mean, I want us to learn stuff, but I don't want it to be complete drudgery either. So, all right, let's see. Oh, we've got a Oh, there's everybody in class. Okay, so we've got a couple minutes left
Hello.
before, go ahead. Do you guys have questions at all right now that aren't being addressed in the chat windows? I don't see any burning questions happening, right? Okay, all right.
No, I'm good to go.
Okay, yeah, so like I said, these first couple of chapters, they're fairly basic, but I want to make sure that we cover some of those. You guys that this may be new for, don't just skip over it. Go look in there and try to make sense out of it. Try some of the activities. You might learn something new, even if you feel like you have used Windows Explorer before, or File Explorer, excuse me. There's always new things you can learn. But I know the first couple of chapters, they're trying to get everybody kind of leveling the playing field because it's a beginning class. So they're playing catch-up ball for some people. So check out Hyper-V or VirtualBox if you can. It's not a hard requirement. I recognize if you're running a laptop and it's only got a little bit of free space, you're just not going to be able to do this. Okay, but otherwise, give it a try, and it'll be a good learning experience for you. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now if I don't have any. And if you have other questions between now and next week, you can message me on Discord or send me an email through the WVC. It's just dburns@wvc.edu. Pretty easy, and I'll get right back to you as quickly as I can. All right, so have a great weekend. I'll stop the recording at this point.